JavaScript is one of those programming languages where you either hate it or you love it. Now, if you're one of those people who hate it, it's probably because of things like the double equal sign, which doesn't make much sense, or that there are multiple keywords that represent the exact same thing, like null and undefined, or for example, how functions just get pushed up to the top of your program even though you didn't ask it to, or that JavaScript is single-threaded, but it also is asynchronous, and the only way to really understand it is by understanding a lot of complex things about event loops and browsers, or it could be something as simple as that there is no main function. I mean, I get why you would hate it. If you come from a background of a C# or Java programming language, then it would seem like you are learning an alien language. And for that very reason, I've decided to make a list of the top 5 misconceptions about JavaScript and why being crazy is not always a bad thing. Just think about your girlfriend when I say that. Number 1. The developers who invented the double equal sign in JavaScript were clearly retarded. Now, you might go ahead and think, hey, the number 2 is clearly not the character 2. I mean, that's pretty obvious. One is a value and the other one is clearly a symbol that you could find in ASCII or Unicode. Now, the reason why the value 2 is equal to the character 2 is simply because that JavaScript is a programming language that was designed to interact with HTML. So for example, if I had an input to request the user for his age to see if he's old enough to access a website, then in that case that input might take in a string. And if it takes in a string, the number that is typed in there would be in character format. And therefore the developers of JavaScript knew that if numbers and characters are going to be constantly compared, then they must return a true value. And if you don't like it, then simply use the triple equal sign. Number 2, null and undefined are practically the same thing. Now, if I go ahead and use the double equal sign on null and undefined, it would actually say to me true, null is equal to undefined. But if I use the triple equal sign, then in that case, it will actually give me false. And the reason why is because this is the strict operator telling us that null is not exactly undefined. They're completely two different things. So for example, if I decided to create a variable and not give it a value and log it to the console, the value of that variable would be undefined. If I want a variable to have the value of null, I would have to explicitly assign it the value of null. And the reason why is because null is not a keyword designed for the users of your application, but rather for the developers who are developing the application. Null is a value that represents no value, just like undefined, but undefined is a value that is automatically given to a variable that you didn't give it a value. So for example, if I decide to log both my undefined and null variables out to the console before declaring it, you would find that both the null and undefined variables will be set equal to undefined, indicating what logged out to the console did not plan out as I expected. And simply setting your undefined variables to null could drastically decrease your amount of debugging time, and that little trick over there might help us debug code in the future. If you find a variable with null, that means you explicitly said I don't want to give it a value, and if it's undefined, that means you forgot to give that variable a value and you better change it. Which brings us to the next JavaScript misconception. Number 3, hoisting is a feature and it was designed to push your functions at the top of the code so it works even when it's not supposed to. Now imagine your little sister walks into your room and starts banging on the keyboard, and then suddenly you run the program and it works better than when you coded it. And that's exactly what they want you to assume when they say the functions in JavaScript get pushed up on top. I mean, you have to understand one thing, and that is computers are stupid, programming languages are stupid, and if the programming language was smart enough to copy stuff and paste them elsewhere and still run, then that means either there's some kind of crazy artificial intelligence going on in JavaScript, or there's a different explanation. Now the real explanation for this is that JavaScript, when it runs in 2 phases. The first being the creation phase and the second being the execution phase. So when the JavaScript is being interpreted in the creation phase, it will take all the variables and set them equal to undefined so that it could know how much memory should be used for the program. But with functions, it's a different case. One does not simply store a function inside of memory, because functions, objects, and arrays are way larger than your average variable. So instead of storing the actual function, what JavaScript does is store the reference to the function. So the next phase is the execution phase, and what happens there is all the functions and all the variables actually start getting their values and start getting executed, and that is where the program actually starts to run. Here's a basic example of the creation phase and the execution phase taking place in this program. So as you can see right over here, I'm logging to the console a variable called x, and then I'm calling a function called func. Then I have the variable x set equal to I'm a hoisted variable, and then I have a function that is logging to the console hello from the hoisted function. Now as you could see, I said I'm a hoisted variable, and that is because variables also get hoisted, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. But if you think about it from the concept of creation phase and then execution phase, what's going to happen is the JavaScript interpreter is going to read the console.log x and is going to say, well, I don't know what x is, so I'm going to ignore that. Then it's going to see a function call. It doesn't know what this function is, so it's going to ignore that. And then it's going to see that there is a variable called x, and it's just going to calculate how much memory should be stored for that variable. And because of that, it will set that variable to undefined. And then it will go to the function. It would see that this is a function and it cannot copy the entire function to memory, so instead it will allocate in the memory for the computer a reference to this function. And then the execution phase will begin. And once the execution phase begins, it will log to the console the variable x. It would say, hey, I know this variable, I've seen it before, let me just go ahead and grab its value. And because this variable did not get a value assigned to it, it will just go ahead and assign it from the value that it received from the creation phase rather than the value from the execution phase. And the value from the creation phase was undefined, so therefore it will log it out as undefined. Then it will go down to the function call and say, hey, I know this function call, I've seen it before, I already referenced it in memory in the creation phase, so I'm going to go ahead and call this function. So then once it calls the function, it will open up the content of the function, and in this case it will find inside of it console.log hello from the hoisted function, and therefore it logs to the console hello from the hoisted function. Then after that it will scroll down again and find that var x has been set equal to I'm a hoisted variable, so therefore it would set x equal to I'm a hoisted variable, and no longer it is set equal to undefined. And then it will scroll down to the last function. This is a function declaration, not a function call, so it does nothing with that, and then the program ends. Now you might be wondering, what did I mean by the variable got hoisted, because clearly it did not. It logged to the console as undefined. But in actual fact of the matter, none of them actually got hoisted. The function didn't get hoisted, nor did the variable. The only difference is the variable got assigned the value of undefined in the creation phase, whereas the function got a reference in the creation phase. And when I say the variable got the value of undefined, I mean it is not an error. For example, if I go ahead and remove the var from the x is equal to I'm a hoisted variable, then in that case this will show up, x is not defined. This is an error saying that the variable x does not exist. Proof that the creators of JavaScript suffered with bad naming convention disorder. So the best way to avoid this is, instead of declaring the function as a function, declare the function as a variable, so that once the creation phase occurs, it will assign the variable equal to undefined, and then in the execution phase, this variable will contain the reference to the function, thus eliminating the possibility of wrongfully hoisting a function. And since this variable is referencing a function but the variable is undefined, the error would change to func is not a function, and that is a whole story for another video. And that is why, in my opinion, hoisting can never be considered as a feature. It's more of a side effect that occurred when the developers of JavaScript decided to make it run with two phases. Now this one is going to freak you out. Number 4, JavaScript has no main function. Now when you think about other programming languages, we normally think of the main function. In C you have it, in Java you have it, C#, and every other programming language that I've never used probably has the main function, which is where the program starts running from. Now in JavaScript we don't have that. We simply just have a JavaScript file and we just type in some JavaScript code wherever it is we like. Now I want you to go ahead and create a JavaScript file, and create a HTML file and connect the JavaScript to the HTML and run the program and go inside of the console. Now if you go inside of the console, you're going to see nothing there, and that is because there is nothing running inside of the JavaScript. But I want you to try something. Go into the console and write down this. Yes, that's right, just this. Now hit enter. Now would you look at that? There is something hiding there, and that is the window object. Now you might be wondering, what is the window object, so let me explain that very briefly. If you decided to grab some HTML elements from the DOM, what you would normally do is write document.querySelector. Well, you can also write window.document.querySelector, and that would work just fine as well. And the reason why is that the document actually resides on the window object. Everything in JavaScript resides on the window object. Even alert resides on the window object. So if you wanted to call something, it will be called from the window object. But the reason why you don't write it is because it is actually arbitrary. You don't need to write window when everything is on window. It's like talking to somebody when there's no one else there and constantly referring to them by name. You don't really need to do that. And the same applies with the main function. The main function is there, and when JavaScript runs, it encapsulates all the code that exists inside of the JavaScript and bundles it up in one main gigantic function, aka the main function. But you don't need to call the function or reference the function because it is simply arbitrary. It is there only to run the entire JavaScript file. And last but not least on our list, number 5, the window object is actually a part of JavaScript. Now before you say,
"Whoa! Wait a minute!"
why don't you just
sit down and stay there until you're told to leave?
Yes, that's right. The window object is not a part of JavaScript, nor is the global object if you're using Node.js. The DOM is not a part of JavaScript. Async and await is not a part of JavaScript. What is a part of JavaScript, however, is anything that is single-threaded. Now, if I go ahead and search for the meaning of single-threaded, I would find that it would say, a thread of execution is the smallest sequence of programmed instructions that can be managed independently. Keyword independently. Now, if I scroll to the meaning of asynchronous, I would find on number 2 it says, identify with the group. Members begin to communicate. So asynchronous is a communication of members in a group. Each group is single-threaded, meaning each person can do one thing at a time. However, all of them working together become asynchronous. And that is exactly how JavaScript was designed. JavaScript was designed in the browser. It was meant to communicate with the HTML document, and then when they invented Ajax, it was meant to make requests to other external servers. So the main goal of JavaScript was to be a programming language that runs inside the browser so that the browser can execute a set of algorithms, a set of instructions so that the programs can be smarter and more interactive. And when JavaScript is communicating with the HTML, that is an asynchronous task that the single-threaded programming language is doing. When JavaScript communicates with external APIs using, for example, promises or async and await, that is JavaScript communicating with external APIs via the network part of the browser. So you could think of the browser as one gigantic box, and JavaScript is a small box inside of this big box with other boxes inside of it, each one doing its own thing. The DOM being responsible for manipulating HTML elements, the network part of the browser being responsible for making requests to APIs, and so on and so forth. Now here's the ingenious part. Once you extract the part of the browser that is responsible for executing the JavaScript, i.e. the V8 engine, if it's Google Chrome, then you can now allow JavaScript to run wherever it is you like, whether it is in the browser. You can also build Android and iOS applications using JavaScript if you are using, for example, React Native. So that is the reason why JavaScript is a diverse language that can run pretty much wherever it is you like. If that particular operating system can run a browser, then that means that operating system can run V8 engine. And if that operating system can run the V8 engine, that means JavaScript runs everywhere. So to be honest, it doesn't really matter if you hate JavaScript because it will catch up with you wherever you are. And on that bombshell, please like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel for more content like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.